Today, we have two speakers for you, both, like I said, from the Department of Anthropology. They're graduate students in that department. And Hannah will be talking to you about the implications of paleoanthropology and discuss some of the new discoveries. And Carlye will be discussing variations in pubertal growth spurt. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to, I think it's Hannah.
Hello, my name is Hannah, and I'm a paleoanthropologist, which means I study ancient humans. I was born in Ohio, although most of my nuclear family now lives in Texas, and I became interested in forensic anthropology as a teenager and attended the University of Texas at Arlington to study anthropology. During my senior year, I was fascinated with archaeology and paleoanthropology, both of which focus on studying early humans, and attended excavations in Romania and South Africa. It was during my time in South Africa that I started asking questions about how early humans and our relatives lived and evolved. So after several gap years, I returned to school, receiving a master's degree in archaeology from the University of Colorado at Denver, and then came to Yale for a PhD. So if we look at this group of apes, we've got humans, Homo sapiens, gorillas, bonobos, orangutans, and gibbons. And we just talked about which one of these is most closely related to us, and it's chimpanzees, who are not on the screen, but also bonobos, our chimpanzees' closest relatives. These are closest living relatives, and then gorillas and other apes, such as the gibbons. And we're all part of a larger group known as primates, which includes monkeys and lemurs. However, the relatives that I primarily study are known as hominins. How do scientists decide what a hominin is? One way to think about this is that hominins are apes that are adapted to walk bipedally, or on 2 feet. While chimps can walk on 2 feet, it is much less efficient and it doesn't make them move faster. When hominins walk on 2 feet, we are able to move quickly and efficiently, saving energy for other uses. All of these groups, except humans, are extinct, and scientists like myself want to know more about them. So today we will be investigating how genetic discoveries have improved scientists' understanding of hominins. We ask questions like, who are these hominins? How are they related to each other? And did they have children together? Well, let's start with a quick note on species. Species describe individuals with a shared genetic lineage and who can have babies who also grow up and have babies together. However, over time, and as groups are separated and brought together by migration or environmental barriers, changes to the genes accumulate. Scientists often try and decide at what point these individuals look or act differently enough to become a new species. But first, let's make sure that you are all DNA experts. If you're not familiar with DNA, just know that your body is made up of approximately 37.2 trillion cells, including your hair, skin, and bones. DNA is not present in all of these cells. DNA is present in all of these cells, although not all of them have a nucleus. A strand of DNA is composed of many base pairs, which are made up of 4 nucleotides, also known as A, T, G, and C. And now, don't worry about memorizing the nucleotides. Just remember that the order of the letters is important. You also need to know that sections of nucleotides are called genes. A gene contains a specific set of instructions for what you will look like. Think of it like a blueprint or instruction manual for the human body. A slight change, and perhaps you have different color eyes. Larger changes, and you would change species entirely. Remember that genes do not come individually, that they are part of a genome, which is another way to say the sum total of all your DNA. So, sections of a DNA strand are called genes. The entire strand is the genome. So imagine you're a scientist and you have this strand of DNA. You want to find out who it belongs to. In order to do this, you need to compare the order of the nucleotides in each section of DNA to see if you can find a match. So if I'm analyzing the 2 genes above, I can tell that they are 2 different individuals, moreover, 2 completely different species, by looking at the mismatch between the top and the bottom row. Scientists can compare the amount of genetic variation to determine how many genes, groups, or species have in common. For example, in group 1 above, although they are all very different, there is DNA shared between humans, rodents, fish, and amphibians. basically every living thing. The difference shrinks when we begin to compare different primates. Instead of comparing different species, we can also look at individuals within one species. If we take DNA from several people in this room and compare it, we will find tiny differences in the combination of nucleotides. So in group 3, we note that there are relatively few genetic differences in humans who are all one species. That's cool, but what does it have to do with fossils? If we look at our family tree, there are a lot of hominins. On the left, you can see the age in millions of years, starting at 1 million at the top, all the way down to 7 million years ago, when the first known hominins appeared. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see that there are only a few hominins known from this time period. As we go through time, more and more hominins have been discovered. Hominins are grouped by physical features, i.e. what they look like. Therefore, Australopithecines, as you can see in the middle of your screen, look more similar to each other than they do to humans. However, everyone on this chart that I'm showing you shares more features with each other than they do with other apes, such as chimps or gorillas. And when I show you this picture, it makes everything look neat and tidy, when in reality, scientists still have a lot to learn about hominins. Not every paleoanthropologist agrees on how they are related to each other. So genetics offers a chance to understand more about our hominin ancestors. Have you heard of Neanderthals? Do you know where they're from? When the first Neanderthal skeleton was discovered over 150 years ago, it created a large stir. People weren't sure if it was human or something else, maybe human with a disease. However, over time, and as more and more Neanderthal skeletons emerged, people began to agree that it was actually a different species. However, scientists still had questions about how Neanderthals fit into our lineage. Were they a sister species, long-lost cousin, someone else entirely? How important is this genetic data anyway? Many humans are interested in finding out more about themselves, and knowing how we got here and what our past looks like is an important piece to that puzzle. More specifically, we can ask, how are we related to Neanderthals and other hominins? Did we interbreed with Neanderthals, and do we carry their genetic code? I know what everyone is thinking. I've seen Jurassic Park. We just need some ancient mosquitoes, right? Very wrong. Paleoanthropologists sequence DNA from bones, although technically we could use saliva, hair, feces, or skin. The problem is that the soft parts of humans don't last for thousands of years. Extracting DNA from Neanderthal bones proved initially very challenging. This is because bones also decay over time, and when they do, the DNA stored inside becomes damaged. Very old bones, like those of dinosaurs, are frequently preserved through fossilization, the process where collagen in bones is replaced with minerals, and the structure of the bone becomes as hard as a rock. As you can imagine, it is quite difficult to extract DNA from a rock. Fortunately, Neanderthal bones are nowhere near as old as dinosaurs and are rarely completely fossilized, but many are still damaged from lying in the ground for thousands or hundreds of thousands of years. With these challenges in mind, scientists needed to find a Neanderthal bone that preserved DNA. It took years. And as they continued to work on this, people developed new technology that allowed them to get better and better at extracting ancient DNA. Finally, in May of 2010, they succeeded, publishing the first Neanderthal genome sequence and its implications. This paper had 56 authors, meaning that it took many, many people in labs all over the world to complete this work. When they compared the sequences of genes, they found two things. First of all, Neanderthals and humans are very closely related, as 99.5% of our genome is identical. We are sister species, meaning that both of us share a common parent ancestor. If you think back to the slide I was showing you earlier with all of the different hominins, well, you may be wondering, which hominin is it? Paleoanthropologists haven't yet been successful in extracting DNA from any specimens that old, so it is still a mystery. Hopefully, with the advent of new technologies, we'll know soon, so keep an eye on the news. Secondly, Researchers discovered that humans and Neanderthals had children together, mixing our DNA lineages. Everyone alive has some Neanderthal DNA. Different human populations have different amounts of DNA. This is because humans evolved in Africa and later left and met Neanderthals. So humans living outside of Africa have more Neanderthal DNA. However, some of these humans later migrated back to Africa, bringing these genes with them. Since then, human populations have continued to explore and migrate, continually mixing our genes. Scientists have also examined the genes that Neanderthals shared with us. Certain genes confer a benefit, that is, they allow us to adapt to living in different environments or to tackle new diseases in the land we explored and have helped our species. Some genes, however, which may have been adaptive for Neanderthals, do not always help humans. Scientists are still researching why this is. Before genetics was available, and even today, most paleoanthropologists use morphology, or a comparison of the size and shape of the bones, to decide how hominins were related. Take a look at the skulls on your screen. I've marked which one is human, but think for a moment about how different the other hominins look. Which one do you think looks the most like us? If you guessed 4, this is correct. But what if a skull looks like it belongs to 2 species? The OIS-1 fossil is a good example of this. It had features that researchers associated with both Neanderthal and human populations, and they argued over whether he/she was more likely Neanderthal or human. Genetics was able to tackle this question and showed that the fossil was from a young male who had DNA from both species. However, 2010 was a year of surprises. When scientists at a cave in Siberia found a small finger bone of a hominin, they decided to run DNA to see if it was human or Neanderthal. Surprise, it was neither. It turned out to be another sister species, now known as Denisovans. This group is more closely related to Neanderthals than humans, but some human populations, specifically Melanesians, have between 4 to 6% Denisovan DNA, suggesting that they met up after humans left Africa. Even more exciting, in 2018, paleoanthropologists found a finger bone of a young girl that was 50% Denisovan and 50% Neanderthal, meaning that she had one parent from each species. Although we know that Neanderthals and Denisovans share DNA, it was a fascinating and rare discovery to find a child of one of these unions. In addition to Denisovans, scientists have discovered genes from 2 other hominins in modern human populations. That means humans met with at least 2 other species and had children with them. Researchers don't yet know much about these hominins, so for now they are referred to as ghost hominins because we're still looking for them. It's possible, as genetic techniques improve, that older and older bones that we've already discovered will be sequenced and turn out to be these hominins. Or maybe, as we continue to explore caves and excavate sites, we will find new species that match this DNA. Possibly both of these scenarios will happen. Perhaps one of you can be the one to make this discovery. Now, if you think back to our species concept, remember that different species are not supposed to be able to have children together. So do you think that Neanderthals and humans are one species or 2? Or do you think that we were maybe in the process of becoming different species, but got back together before this change could fully occur? You don't have to tell me this answer, just think about it. So if you came here hoping I would have all the answers about hominins, I'm sorry to disappoint you. Paleoanthropology is a very active field, and new discoveries are published every week. Genetics has shown us that when humans first left Africa and began moving to Europe and Asia, they met with other hominins and shared genes with them. Some of those genes helped us adapt to these new environments, others probably not so much. It has also helped clarify humans' place in our family tree, but it is limited by the preservation of the bones, which is forcing scientists to be more innovative as they work to understand hominins. While it has given us many answers, it has also given us many more questions. This is how science is supposed to work, building on our knowledge and exploring the universe. As more fossil discoveries are made and as genetic methods improve, scientists will be able to better understand how humans got here and what makes us human. Thank you.
So one question, very simple, is what time period were Denisovans and Neanderthals living in?
So we don't know entirely because there are only a few pieces of Neanderthal bones that have been found, but Denisovan bones that have been found, but Neanderthals went extinct around 40,000 years ago, and it looks like they evolved somewhere between 400 and 300,000 years ago. So at some point in time between there.
Cool. Another question is, if an archaeologist finds a fossil, how can they tell the difference between a really old fossil and a more recent fossil?
So when the archaeologists dig a site, they look very carefully at the stratigraphy of the site. So we don't just go in there with shovels anymore and randomly throw dirt around. We dig very carefully with trowels and we take photographs and we look at how the changes in the sediment occur. And we use different dating methodologies to make sure that when we find a fossil, we don't just take it out and remove it. We looked at the entire context surrounding that fossil.
Awesome. And a third question is about DNA. So they ask, at what point in the difference of DNA does it cross the line from one species to another? So a follow-up or a better question, they're asking, like, why isn't a monkey with similar DNA to humans part of a human species?
So the chimps have the most similar DNA to humans. It's about 98.6% or something similar to humans. But if you look at chimps and humans, you notice a number of physical differences immediately, and you probably notice a number of behavioral ones as well. This is because the little bit of DNA where there's a difference has a big impact on how we grow, what we eat, the environment we live in. So yeah, they're not, when you look at them, they're not actually that similar. But if you were to compare, say, two much closer individuals, say two different species of monkey that have very similar DNA, if you look at something like where they're living, what they're eating, how they're behaving, scientists often use these other contexts to say these are different species. The problem with the fossil record and these hominins that I've been talking about is we can't actually observe them. So we're trying to make a lot of inferences based on the morphology of the fossils and on the different environments that the fossils are being found. We look at their teeth to try and determine if they were eating different types of food. And then we have a lot of arguments about whether or not it's a different species.
And one last question that is burning up in the chat. The students want to know, can we evolve into a new species?
Yes, absolutely. There have been changes to humans over the last several hundred years, very small ones, but for example, our jaws are becoming more reduced. So if you know anyone who's had their third molar taken out, because your jaw doesn't quite have the space for it anymore because we're eating different types of food. So with enough time, remember that this takes time. It takes thousands and hundreds of thousands of years for an animal of our size to become a new species. But yes, I think that we will become something else.
Awesome. Thanks so much for a great presentation, Hannah.
Thank you.
my name's Carlye, like Hannah. I'm an anthropologist, but I don't study paleoanthropology. And so I'll be talking about variation in the tempo and timing of puberty. And I wanted to introduce myself a little more before I got into that. I'm originally from just outside of St. Louis, Missouri, and I did my undergrad at Washington University, where I majored in biology and anthropology and minored in Spanish. And so I knew about anthropology going into college because I was obsessed with the TV show Bones. But as I took more classes in college, I realized I didn't want to be a forensic anthropologist. I wanted to work with living people, and I was really interested in how aspects of our environment, our behavior, our activity can influence our biology. And so I actually ended up doing an undergrad thesis on how physical activity affects immune function, looking at athletes and non-athletes. But when I went to grad school, I started to focus more on development and reproductive biology. And a really important event in the process of developing reproductive biology is puberty. And it's just the process of growing into an adult body. But associated with that are a lot of changes. So the pubertal growth spurt, adolescent growth spurt, which I'll talk more about in a few minutes, but also other changes like facial hair, sweating more, getting your first pimple, things like that. But to talk about the kickoff of puberty, we have to mention the endocrine system, and that's the body's chemical messenger system. And those messengers are hormones, and so chemicals that send signals throughout the body. At the start of puberty, the hypothalamus starts making a lot more of some certain hormones, and those go to the anterior pituitary. These are both areas in the brain. And then those hormones then go throughout the body, and when they reach the gonads, they help produce estradiol, progesterone, testosterone, and that is a really important step in starting this process. But why do we even go through it? Why aren't we just born into an adult body? To think about that, we need to think about energy and energy budgets. So budget, you have probably thought about in terms of money, right? I get my paycheck, I have to pay my rent, I have to pay my groceries. The money I use on groceries, I can't also use for rent. In the same way, your body can use energy to grow, but that energy used for growing, it can't use to fight off a cold if you get sick. And so if we're looking at a kid's energy budget, between these three categories of reproduction, maintenance, and growth, kids are really allocating energy towards growing and towards maintenance. And so those are things like fighting off a cold, like I mentioned, or just general cellular repair. And after puberty, when you're an adult, there is that third category, reproduction, comes into the picture. Adults aren't really growing anymore, so there's not really energy in the budget for that. But energy continues to be spent between maintenance and now reproduction. Not just actively reproducing, but maintaining reproductive tissues, maintaining high levels of certain hormones, all of that requires energy. And so puberty allows your body to have time to grow and develop and get big enough so that once you hit puberty, you have a big enough budget and you're developed enough to make that switch in your energy budget. And now let's talk about the timing of puberty. Go ahead and answer in the chat at what age you think people normally go through puberty.
We
Great.
have a lot of answers.
Awesome.
Some people say 11 to 15, 12 to 13, 10, 12, 13. There's a lot of answers.
Great. Well, that's all in the right range. So if we look at the United States, average age at puberty for girls is 12, and average age at puberty for boys is 14. If we expand our view to include some other countries, we see 11, 13, things like that. And remember, this is just the average. There are people older and younger than that. And then if we look to even more places, we may see some values that are more extreme. So up to 16 and a half over here. And this variation, the reasons behind it, we can group into two categories. So one is genetics and the other is the environment. So if we start with genetics, we used to think that only around 100 or so genes contributed to the timing of puberty, but a recent study found that 389 genes contribute to this, and that's a lot. Things like whether you have dry or wet earwax are only controlled by one single gene. Even things that are more complicated, like eye color, require only 16 genes. So close to 400 is a lot. And depending on what versions of these genes you have, you might go through puberty a little earlier or a little later. And these genes, that same study found that these genes and their variants are distributed pretty similarly all around the world. So the same genes that contribute to being to going through puberty earlier or later in the US are the same ones responsible for the same thing in other places. Altogether, these account for about 50 to 75% of the variation in pubertal timing. That's a lot, but there's still that 25 to 50% that is unaccounted for. And that's where we turn to the environment. And so here I have this graph that shows average age at menarche, which is when a female-bodied individual gets their first period. It's often used as a marker of the timing of puberty. And we see for the US, which is in blue here, that over the last 100 or so years, average age at puberty has decreased. But if we look at the other countries in this graph, while they show that average age at puberty is different, across all of them, average age at puberty is decreased. And this is too fast for genes to have changed. And so it has to do with something in the environment. And this brings us back to our energy budgets. So here we have, again, a child's energy budget distributed between growth and maintenance. But what do you think happens when you get sick? If energy used for one thing can't also be used for another, the sizes of the slices of the pie have to change. And so your body will put more energy towards maintenance and a little less towards growth. And so over the past 100 years, we've seen that something in our environment has changed that is related to this timing of puberty. And what aspects of the environment do you think contribute to this? So these could be things that make your pie bigger, so you have more energy to distribute between all the things, or smaller, or change the sizes of the slices of the pie. So quick throw in the chat what kinds of things you think in the environment are contributing to variation in puberty, timing of puberty. Let's see, I see air quality, I see weather, food, air, diets, great. So these are all great answers. So food is a big one. Exercise is also, whether that's exercise or work, a big contributor. Exposure to infectious disease. So you remember how someone got sick, the pie changed. Access to health resources. And I wanted to throw this one in stress because I find it really interesting in that we're only recently talking about how stress contributes to the timing of puberty. And we also aren't exactly sure, how much stress, what kinds of stress, things like that. So there's a lot to still be discovered here too on aspects of the environment that contribute to variation. But I also wanted to talk about not just timing of puberty in general, but a really concrete example with the adolescent growth spurt. And so if we come back to the endocrine system, the hypothalamus releases hormones when you go through this growth spurt. They go to the anterior pituitary again. And the anterior pituitary releases growth hormone. And that does what it says. It helps you grow. And it also, more growth hormone is associated with growing faster. And so this we call growth velocity. And this is different than height. So height is shown by this graph here. When you're 12, you're expected to be taller than when you're 2. Makes sense. But growth velocity is this, how many centimeters per year, how many inches per year are you growing? When you're a baby, like 0 to 2, you're growing really fast. But once you hit childhood, the 2 to 10 range, you start growing much slower. You're still growing, but it's more of a steady growth. until you hit the adolescent growth spurt. You start to grow really quick again before dropping off, and you're about done. And so I'm just going to present a couple examples of variation in this timing and tempo of this growth spurt. And we'll start with a study that worked with the Shuar, who are horticulturists and hunter-gatherers, meaning that they grow some of their own food, but they also hunt their own food too. And this means that their energy budget is different than ours. They don't just go down the street to pop into the grocery store and pick up dinner. They're expending a lot more energy getting their food than we are. And they live in Southeast Ecuador in the Amazon rainforest. And so this study worked with both boys and girls. And among boys, they found that Shuar boys grow slower. You can see by this red line here, and peak about the same time as these international standards. And so these international standards are based mostly on the way children grow in the US and Europe. If we look at girls, Shuar girls grow slower than the international standards and peak a little bit earlier. So we can see that between people living in these different environments, we see variation in the timing and tempo. But I also wanted to present an example from a study where people didn't differ quite so much in their environment. So this next study took place in the UK, United Kingdom, and Europe. And they worked with thousands of children and were able to group them into 9 groups based on the timing and tempo that they went through puberty, or the growth spurt in this case specifically. So if we look at boys, this orange line shows what we would expect, a period of slow, steady growth, a big adolescent growth spurt, and then a drop off. And so that was one group of boys. But then another group of boys they found went through this growth spurt a little differently. They had a little childhood growth spurt, grew a little bit slower for a while, then had a smaller, but still a peak in their growth before dropping off. We see something similar with the girls in the variation in the timing. So of these 9 groups, they put girls into, or were able to divide girls into. This pink group went through the adolescent growth spurt around 10-ish. And while everybody's mostly the same shape in terms of the tempo, this pink group, which is the most different, went through their growth spurt around age 13. And so hopefully what I've gotten across is that both genetics and the environment contribute to why puberty is different from person to person. And that means that going through puberty at a different time than anybody else is totally normal. And it would really be surprising if you hit your adolescent growth spurt at the same time as your best friend. And I think the fact that that genetic study that I mentioned identified almost 4 times, found that more than 3 times as many genes are responsible for the timing of puberty as we previously thought. And that stress is this relatively new aspect of the environment that we're starting to consider, that there's a lot more work to be done in figuring out what contributes to variation in pubertal timing. So that's where I'll end. This picture on the right is a stadiometer, which is a thing that I've used in my research to measure height going from house to house. It folds up and fits in the backpack I'm wearing in the other picture.
That was awesome, Carlye. We do have a few questions from the students. So one question is it possible to make human bodies go through puberty earlier by having the body produce certain hormones?
So in terms of the growth spurt, you could make someone grow faster by administering growth hormone to them. As far as kicking off the process of puberty, we're not entirely sure of what the mechanism that starts that whole complex process. So probably not puberty as that larger process.
Okay, awesome. Another question, it refers to the growth spurt chart. So the student asks, why does the growth spurt chart level out after the spurt for some boys and girls, but not for others?
In that, so for some people, it just works with their particular genes, their particular environment, right? That they hit that growth spurt and then drop straight off. They're done growing. But other people, especially if the peak of that growth spurt wasn't as sharp, they may continue to grow and just slowly stop growing before they are done growing.
Cool. Another good question is, if the human life expectancy has increased over the past 100 years, why is puberty coming earlier?
That's a great question. And that really gets at some of this environment piece. So for your body, it doesn't, if we give your body kind of a active like voice here, we can humanize it, which is not exactly how it works. But your body's getting more energy and more things like that in the environment we have now than we did like 100 years ago. So that's why it's like, oh, I have enough energy, I can do this change. And there's no real reason for your body to wait and delay it. So there's no real incentive fitness-wise for your body to delay it, especially in such a good environment.
Hey, Carlye, I have a follow-up question to what you just answered. So what if the body isn't growing or can't grow? Do you know what's going on there?
So can you clarify? Sorry.
Like if you don't have energy allocated for growing, and it's like in a child's body that's supposed to be growing.
So what happens then is you see things like growth stunting, which is when for someone's age, they're a lot shorter than they should be. And that typically happens in environments where people aren't getting the nutrition that they need. And so their body can't put energy towards growing.
Another question, is it possible to take supplements to make puberty go faster?
Not that I know of, and if there are, I would not recommend. Maybe talk to your doctor, but those probably wouldn't be terribly healthy things to do.
I 100% agree. Another question, do you know any resources online where the students could learn more about puberty?
Ooh, I don't have anything off the top of my head, but I can look something up and have you all share it out.
That would be great. Much, much appreciated. Another question, can becoming sick slow the process of puberty?
So in really extreme environments, maybe, but like for us, who, if you're in a food secure environment where you're getting plenty of food and you can just walk to the fridge, even when you're sick and, eat, probably not, right? So that's sometimes when you're sick, you're maybe more hungry afterward, or you're more tired, you're conserving energy when your body's tired. So there are still trade-offs. You still can't use energy for more than one thing, but because that energy budget is bigger, there aren't that many decisions that have to be made with that budget.
Awesome. And what would the effect of changing the balance of hormones in the human body be?
It depends on what hormones, because there are tons of hormones doing all sorts of things. So it would really depend on which one we're talking about.
Awesome. And then one last question. The students want to know, why do people shrink as they get older? Or is it possible for people to shrink as they get older?
Yeah, so I don't do aging research, but because of things like bone mass changes with time, I believe it has to do with like bone density changes. So you're not losing necessarily length, I guess, in your height, but everything's kind of getting a little weaker.
Awesome. Thanks so much for answering the questions, Carlye, and for a fantastic talk. I'm going to hand it off for the outro.
Hi, everyone. We saw in the chat some people were talking about gender. And so gender is it can be a really complicated topic because it's defined by a lot of the people around us, what gender is. And so people identify with a whole range of genders. So a lot of times we hear about boys and girls, and some people identify that way, but other people don't. Some people identify as non-binary, meaning they don't like this dichotomy between boys and girls, and they don't feel like that represents them. So they might identify as something else. And that's really great. And we want to make sure that we respect all of those gender identities. And however you choose to identify, whatever fits best for you, that's what you should identify as. And although, sometimes we talk about it in these two ways, that's definitely not the whole spectrum. People come in all different shapes and sizes, and they're all wonderful. And we want all of you to be in science so that you can help us learn about these things. And so we can talk about them in a little more nuanced ways and capture all of this.
I just want to add to that. Thank you so much, Shannon, for clarifying. And so in the talk, I largely use the terms interchangeably boy, girl, male, female, and I probably shouldn't have in retrospect, because a lot of the processes I was talking about referred to biological sex, which is totally different from gender identity. And we actually need more research on experiences of going through puberty and how that varies with different gender identities too.